Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
Here we go. It is May the 1st. Welcome in. We've made the turn into the new month. And yeah, that's Queen Victoria off the top. So we'll be celebrating all the things Queen Victoria by the end of this month. Yeah, we're making the turn to summer. That's all right. It is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Welcome in. I'm Dave Trafford, and there's lots to talk about today. We will get into, I don't know if there's a suicidal tendency in the Conservative Party across the country or what's going on there, but boy, there's a lot of infighting going on one way or the other, and this is only 3 days after the fallout from the election. We'll also get into the question of the election of judges. The rant is just too good to ignore. Talk a little bit more about the school board situation here in Ontario, the number of jobs that are likely to be lost as a result of tariffs, and then Premier Ford responding to Mark Carney's win and now the Prime Minister officiel in the minority government. All right, around the table today, Kathleen Wynne is here, former Premier of Ontario. Tim Hudak is with us, a partner at Council Public Affairs and former leader of the PC Party of Ontario, and our veteran pollster and founder, producer, and host of the show, John Wright, is here. And Keith Leslie, unable to join us this week for our weekly edition, but Keith did sit in on our post-election recap. So if you want to have a listen to what Keith had to say about the fallout from the election, by all means, make sure you dip into the previous episode of that. All right. So we alluded to this a little bit, Tim, when we were talking about the post-election results and the Jivani rant against Doug Ford, I thought was remarkable. And we'll play the whole thing here because I thought, David Common was at Jivani's election campaign and his headquarters, and then was there for the event and actually for the speech, and then talked to him afterwards about it. So I don't know what was more incendiary, his actual speech accepting the win or the interview with David Common. But it was good.
Fire, right?
But right. So, but here's the thing. Our friend Sabrina Nanji at the Queen's Park Observer this morning publishing, in her newsletter. Now you've got Nick Kouvalis going at it hammer and tong with Andrew Scheer, and somehow Andrew Scheer wants to pick a scab and say, well, we got more votes in Ontario than Doug Ford did. And then Kouvalis comes back and, just use all kinds of invective and so on to talk about, how badly the Conservative Federal Party did and blah, 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 blah. I mean, Tim, do you really want the feds picking a fight with a guy that here in Ontario has historically won 3 majority governments in the province of Ontario?
No. Well, I'm just trying to think, what's that old expression, Dave, that you don't pick a fight with the media because they've got barrels of ink and paper. There's got to be a political version of that in terms of a very successful premier in Canada's largest province, who actually has a national profile as well that's in pretty good shape right now as a result of his Captain Canada stint when we had a leadership vacuum nationally. Okay, so these are my people. I know all the characters. I found it a little bit entertaining though too, just to see the battle.
Well, I heard you the other day talking about how y'all bring knives to your caucus meetings.
Well, yeah, that's the joke I was going to say is something I learned early on. Is like, well, I'll start that. Every party has its chronic disease. I will argue the Liberals, it tends to be corruption that brings them down. The Democrats, chronic disease is ideology, and the Conservatives is fratricide. I learned early on that when I go into a caucus meeting, I should have my notebook. I guess I should have my phone, and then you bring a knife to pretty well every caucus meeting, just in case they come out, and that's happening big time today. I will say that I think this is, though, more personal than any conspiracy. I don't think this is about people motivating and clearing room for Doug Ford to emerge as, the next Conservative leader and Prime Minister, or the Premier of Nova Scotia as well. You know, I don't think Houston's angling that way. I think there's just been clashes between the warlords and their assistant warlords and their pollster warlord between the two levels. That they and I'll be interested what Premier Wynne has to say, and John too. But there's a particular breed that exists. That's the warlord that wants to show they are the most dominant, smartest, the surest way, you know, to win an election victory. And right now, I think it all centers around that clash and leaders who didn't rein them in.
Well, let's just listen to what Jamil Jivani had to say to David Common, because I think this is just the fuse that's being lit. It hasn't quite exploded yet.
Doug Ford just went through an election. I have differences of opinion with him. I don't like how he's managed healthcare or education, but out of respect, we didn't say anything. Federal party, we didn't get in his way. When it was our turn to run an election, he couldn't stay out of our business, always getting his criticisms and all his opinions out, distracting our campaign, trying to make it about him, trying to position himself as some kind of political genius that we needed to be taking cues from.
Was it him specifically? Was it his campaign manager, Corey, tonight? Do you see Doug Ford as a problem for the federal party in the outcome of this race?
I see Doug Ford as a problem for Ontario and for Canada. I think he's not doing a great job in running this province, and now he's trying to exercise his influence over other levels of government, and it's not like this guy is doing anything particularly well. I mean,
you did used to work for him.
I did. I'm speaking from experience. I tried to fix problems in this province, and he kept getting in his way and all his goons around him all the time. They wouldn't make anything better, and now we're seeing him because this guy's a political genius because he beat Bonnie Crombie and Stephen Del Duca, and now we got to sit around getting advice from him? No. He has taken the provincial Conservative Party and turned it into something hollow, unprincipled, something that doesn't solve problems. He's glad-handing with Chrystia Freeland, having coffees and lattes with Mark Carney. And I'm sitting here saying we need to be fighting for change and something new and something different, not being a hype man to the Liberal Party.
So, Kathleen, when the old line is, you know, when your opponent is driving the tractor trailer off the cliff, just let him go.
I'm just tempted to say, no comment. No, Jamil Jivani is, he's a particular, I don't know about your caucus meetings, Tim. I didn't take knives to caucus meetings ever, but, I think that the point about this being more personal than sort of broader than that, than strategic, I think makes sense. That rings true. Jamil Jivani is a guy who started working with one of my good friends in the Liberal Party. He worked with Michael Coteau, and then all of a sudden he's working with Doug Ford, and then now he's angry at Doug Ford. So I think he's going to float around, and he's kind of angry at the world, it seems like. Nick Kouvalis, I think it's interesting, this provincial federal antipathy, but it really must be very hard on people like you, Tim, who want to work with the party and who want to make sure that there are good outcomes, because it just looks so fractured and so like there's no unity, there's no kind of plan. And I know there's no plan. I know that we're in the aftermath of an election that every one of those people thought the Tories were going to win. And so there's rancor, and I think there's that disunity because I guess nobody really knows what's coming next, what Poilievre's going to do, whether he's going to be supported, whether he's going to try to run in a by-election. None of those things are a certainty in terms of the party's future. And so I think that's what we're seeing. There's a bit of disarray there. And a lot of that is personal disappointment. People are hurting. People are really angry and upset about what happened. And that's what it looks like.
Well, the Premier clearly, John, had to stick handle the question almost immediately the morning after when he scrummed at Queen's Park.
He called you a problem for Ontario and Canada, suggesting you're not a true conservative.
Yeah, I know. Anyways, I'm not worried about that. I'm focusing on unity right across this country. We have to bring this country together.
Well, and he's right, I guess, and that was the right posture. But once we get into his comments about the judges, things became a little unhinged. So it was an interesting juxtaposition of tone from the Premier. But it's interesting.
Many faces of Doug Ford, Dave.
Well, I'm just saying.
you know,
I'm just
like
saying.
the statesman is kind of a learned behavior.
Yeah.
Because those first 2 years at Queen's Park, Doug Ford was all over the map, you know, and so he, through COVID and the teleprompter and the, you know, then the crisis with Trump, there is no doubt he has put on a different cape, you know, and there's a different Doug Ford that comes to those situations. But the things we're going to talk about in a minute, you know, the provincial issues, the local issues where he loses his temper, like I think that's somehow the real guy who was elected in 2018, who was, you know, on a rant at City Hall when he was a councillor. And I think that's kind of core to who he is. Anyway, we can come back to that. But the many faces of Doug Ford, I think that's kind of what we're seeing.
Yeah, well, John, I just think that on one hand, Ford's response was correct in terms of that high road response to Jivani. You know, it doesn't surprise me that Nick Kouvalis is the guy throwing darts the other way in terms of from the province back into Ottawa. But surely this does not help anybody federally, particularly with the Conservatives, in as much as there's so many distractions already. But again, I go back to the point I made with Tim. You're picking a fight with the guy who might be the most popular Conservative in the country.
I think this is all inside baseball to which people like us are paying attention to and no one else cares. Like I don't know how anyone outside of a small group of people are following a knife fight or more on Twitter between a former leader and Nick Kouvalis, let alone anybody really know who Nick is, what his character is like, or anything else. I mean, so setting that aside for a moment, I think that the premier dealt with it in the best way, and it was just kind of like he kind of smiled, smirked, and said, "Yeah, whatever," and moved on. You know, it's a bit of a warning as well about this particular individual, because he does turn the cannons inside. It's not just to the outside potential target, it can be inside as well. So I don't put much into this. I think that, you know, the highest level Conservatives are thinking about what the next steps will be. And I'm even a little, I'm surprised, but not totally, that we haven't heard from Mr. Poilievre, you know, since election night. But he's got to obviously consider what's going on. And then the second thing is, Michael Chong put in the process for how a leader is either, you know, accepted after an election or rejected. I can't see at the moment how that group of people are going to reject Mr. Poilievre. And so I think we need to take some time, but I don't think anybody's really paying attention to that at the moment. Not at all.
When we get to the point, though, Tim, where, you know, we're trying to decide what's going to happen internally for the Conservatives and whether or not, you know, Poilievre's going to make it, and there's conversations around, you know, who might be an interim leader if necessary. There just seems to be everything is on fire right now, where, you know, and that seems to be the response internally. And it's just brought up this way. Now, whether we can paint the brush and say, well, there's only the provincial Conservatives and the federal Conservatives. And to your point, John, we see that difference. I'm not sure that the average Canadian sees that difference, Tim.
So I think I'm going to disagree with my friend John here. I think people do watch this because it's easy to understand that there's warring, you know, parties. And these things are eminently clippable, right? Like fired up. So I think people watch it, but to John's more important point, does it have an impact now? Nobody's job is up right now, with the exception, I guess, of Poilievre's. We're not going to have a federal election for some time, and the provincial is 4 years distant. So it's not consequential. This is a fire, and folks are throwing gas on the fire because there's obviously been a lot of bad blood, you know, between the National Party and their second cousins, the Provincial Party, and the Nova Scotia, and some bully tactics from Poilievre. I still don't know why he didn't reach out. I remain very, indebted to Prime Minister Harper, who reached out to me regularly at meetings in his beautiful office in Ottawa. He gave me some excellent advice. It's not uncommon that parties don't exactly back each other 100% because they're focused on advancing their own interests. But this type of gunfight I've not seen maybe since, like, you know, Chrétien Martin days nationally. bottom line here is the fire will eventually peter out. Ford's got a big job to do. And then I think federally it's going to last until Poilievre either gets the blessing of his caucus, which I think is likely, or has to face a leadership vote.
How much of this, Kathleen Wynne, just, I mean, we alluded to Chrétien and Martin, so it's not just particular to the Conservatives. The Liberals have had their own, infights and knife fights to some degree, the way this is played out. And it's easy to say this will burn out in terms of media, but there are still people in the Martin and Chrétien camp who still, bear those scars and still talk about them as if they were fresh wounds.
Yeah, I guess to Tim's point about the fire burning out and Poilievre deciding what he's going to do, because I think that must be what's going on. There must be, for him and his family, and then for him and his team, this is a time of reflection. But I think what's interesting is whether he's going to be able to emerge, if he actually is going to stay, if he will emerge and be able to bring the factions together. You're right. There are people who bear scars from all parties over time. I think that those antipathies die hard, but they can become secondary if there's someone who pulls people together and says, this is the path we're on, we're going down it together. And I just wonder if Poilievre can do that. I wonder if Pierre Poilievre actually has the capacity to do that, because I also wonder why it has been allowed to get to this point and to get to this public, to get to be this public, why he hasn't reached out, why there hasn't been some attempt to at least sort of paper over the differences between the provincial and the federal parties. So I think the question right now is whether Pierre Poilievre is going to be able to come out of wherever, whatever dark room he's in right now, and bring people together and start to rebuild the sort of tone of unity in the party. I think that's an open question right now.
Well, I think it's a good one, John, in terms of, where does the official opposition sit? I mean, we of all times, we need a strong opposition to the Carney government. And I know we can get into, your comments about, what exactly is Mark Carney bringing to the table. If we don't have a strong opposition in place, that's not, again, got the guns turned inwards on themselves, that's a problem all around for us. So there's that distraction in and of itself is an issue. But is Poilievre the guy who can pull all of these people together and put the fires out?
Well, as I've said, I don't think the general public's paying attention to what's going on. I'll double down on that. I mean, if you ask anybody, even in my own family, if they know even who Nick Kouvalis is or that, they simply don't. Number two, they are aware of a rift which exists between the leader of the Conservative Party and Doug Ford, because the two, Doug Ford has made an issue of that. I mean, from a perspective of the insiders, like those of us who watch this, I don't know how you repair it except between the two leaders of the parties. Otherwise, it's going to be internecine warfare between the participants on one side versus the others, and there's been no way in which either of the leaders have reached out and said, guys, can you cool it? Just give us a chance to try and heal this. Because at the end of the day, I don't know whether it means that Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Ford, go to lunch in the Ottawa market and, have soup together to calm the waves. But right now, I think it's pretty raw. And that's what we're getting. The second thing is much to your point, and that is who's going to represent, the opposition in the House of Commons and on a daily basis. You got to think it's got to be Melissa Lantsman. But, Mr. Poilievre's got to assign, obviously as the leader of the party, who's going to represent different portfolios. There are different people who are now being elected. He's got some candidates to choose from who are going to be very articulate and have different points of view, but it requires a separate strategy because he's not there. I mean, I see that there's 2 or 3 who have already offered to have him take their seats and run. So that's not an issue there. I mean, and then the question is, well, when does that happen? If he does decide to go through it, and it could be well by the end of 2025. I'm not really sure that the Liberals are going to be in much of a hurry to get him back to the House of Commons anyways. So all of this stuff is in play, but I think it's just filling a lot of silence at the moment. We're looking at the campaigners go at each other. But I don't know how you heal the rift on that. But I do know that Doug Ford is pragmatic. I do know that, if he could, set aside some of this stuff and tell his own folks to chill, and so would Pierre Poilievre tell everybody, look, let's just take a powder here for a while and see, look at on the inside of what we can do. I think they could do that. I don't know whether they are going to do that. So taking it into the House of Commons, the new agenda, they're going to be dealing with a new prime minister that, as I said last week or on Tuesday, we don't know that much about. I really, have to say that he campaigned on a platform that I think didn't have a whole lot of his input. Like it had, he went out and espoused it, but I don't think that he created it. Justin Trudeau, you would have known, would have been to the table and would have identified what he wanted to do. But I don't know how he's going to be in the House. I don't know whether he's going to be an interventionist. I don't know whether or not he's going to be more pragmatic and steal things from the Conservatives to put it in, the throne speech to do what he's going to do. So I think that's going to keep the Conservatives a little bit on edge, because I don't think they know, who he is and what we're going to be dealing with when we finally get there.
Okay, I just want to take the opportunity here just to remind folks who are listening or watching, make sure you subscribe to that, because you'll get more of that kind of insight in the podcast as we move forward. Kathleen, on that point though, the idea of what we're going to get from Carney, are we going to get a hint of that when he actually meets Donald Trump next week in the White House?
Yeah, I think we're going to start to see that very quickly over the next few days. I think that the fact that there is going to be a meeting between him and President Trump, I think is important. I think that around that meeting, you will start to hear how he's thinking. I think that, as I said before, I believe that there must be a very active conversation about cabinet right now, and we'll start to get a sense of how he's thinking about the face of this government to the country. So yeah, I think we're going to get those. I think we're going to get those indications very quickly. I just want to say on the Pierre Poilievre issue and the divisions in the party and so on, I think the path is very clear. Honestly, if Pierre Poilievre came out today or tomorrow and made a speech about the importance of just what you guys were talking about, the official opposition, the importance of understanding that there are, I read somewhere somebody was talking about many shades of blue, the need for a bigger tent and set up something with Doug Ford. John, you said Doug Ford is a pragmatist. Absolutely. And he's an opportunist. And so, he would, if Pierre Poilievre was making nice, Doug Ford would make nice, because that makes his tent bigger. Like, I don't think it's rocket science to think about how Pierre Poilievre could take the stage in a statesman-like way if he had that in him, or if he had that desire. Like, I think a leader in this situation could make a gesture that would bring people together, at least, as I said, paper over those differences in the public eye, because most people aren't paying very, very close attention to this internal war. So if Pierre Poilievre were able to come out and, play the statesman in terms of the party, I think it would work. I just don't know whether he can do it.
Well, Tim, in the olden days, we would have been having a conversation about how the elders in the party would have stepped up and sort of negotiated this rift. And, Brian Mulroney would have been a great guy to bring into the room and say, okay, boys, sit down. Now we're going to have an adult conversation. Is there a role there for Stephen Harper? I mean, he played a role in the campaign vis-a-vis the commercials that he showed up in. I mean, is there a play there to sort of, okay, just chill?
No, I don't.
No,
I don't. I think it's very emotional nationally for them, because they thought they were, measuring the drapes in the prime minister's office, and they're back in opposition. It's big stakes. And, when it comes to leaders, and I've been in that category, pretty big egos there in the room. That's a very combustible formula. So appreciate what you said. I'll get back to, I think, what actually brings folks together. Premier Wynne's comments about sort of the states were like and Big Tent and stuff like that, I think what it does is mistakes the audience right now. Poilievre's audience will be one of, okay, what do I need to survive to fight another day? So I think that's more so with reinforcing his strength among conservatives, those that buy memberships, those that run riding associations, more the core. So I anticipate his message is not general audience right now. It's very targeted to make sure he is returned as leader or maintains his leadership position. Okay. How do people come together at the end of the day? When you've got that much of a combustible mix, it's actually an outside issue that throws cold water on that with the sort of a stark reality. Let me explain by example. There's no secret there was no love lost between John Tory and Doug Ford. The Ford family versus Tory, goes way back. Those emotions were deep. There's a lot of animosity there. But because Premier Ford and Mayor Tory's fates were aligned to try to relieve gridlock, reduce crime, getting the subways moving again, because they were interlinked, they were forced to get together because of the practicality of solving those issues. So I think the only way this actually gets solved, the depth it is when they actually have to work together on something concrete that ties their fate hand to hand. But I don't think that's going to be for a while.
Yeah, well, I expected to your point though, Tim. There is runway there. It's not like this is again. It's urgent in the moment in terms of how we're observing this, but there are other things and bigger issues nationally that have to be kind of dealt with on the horizon. Having said that, if in fact Mr. Poilievre is not going to run in a by-election until the end of the calendar year, Tim, they need an interim leader in the legislature, right? And we've all thrown Melissa Landsman's name into the mix here, and just because as a deputy already. But it occurs to me that typically the interim leader would not take a role if we're going to run for leadership, and if the leadership were up for grabs, right?
I don't think it's going to happen in that order.
No, that's what I'm saying. So I think that'll be the tell.
Look, I think. So that would only take place, Dave, I think, if Poilievre lost a vote in caucus under the Reform Act and there was a leadership, then they would have an interim leader that's actually in the legislation. It would have to be named on the spot, who would not be a candidate. In the meantime, I think Melissa Landsman would be terrific as a spokesperson in Parliament. She's talented, she's smart, she comes across well. They need to appeal more into Eastern Canada than Western today. Plus, she's a Hudak School graduate. That's got to count for something. Correct. I would love to have her on my team. I'm thrilled with her success. I'll set aside that bias. And they've got to resist the folks around Poilievre, right? It's kind of can be a closed group. They got to resist the temptation to sideline Melissa or other people that are more, maybe more appealing right now out of jealousy to protect their leader. They want the best talent on the ice, and I think that's her.
Yeah, Kathleen, I think that's the challenge, right? I mean, we're back to the big egos in the room and all of the political, plays in mind. But there is that issue of business as usual. Can't just be business as usual. We've got to move things forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree with Tim's analysis of the Melissa Landsman situation. She would be like the leader in the House. And I think that would be the wisest choice for Poilievre to make. I don't think it precludes. I hear what you said, Tim, about the needing to reinforce the people who are his core support, but that doesn't broaden his appeal much. Anyway, I mean, that was the discussion throughout the election campaign. But I think turning to somebody like Melissa would exactly be the kind of voice that was needed. Now, she may need to temper her anger a bit sometimes in the House. But
now she's got Jamil Jivani.
She's got Jamil. Jamil can be her pit bull.
That's right. John, to the point though around the issue of the Tories needing to appeal to their base, they had a really strong performance in terms of the popular vote. So I'm not sure that necessarily is an issue in the short term.
I don't think it is. And I think, you know, the way in which they did in Southwestern Ontario and how they performed in the 905 region, I mean, they're very, very strong. And a lot of the votes are within hundreds of votes. A number of the seats that the Liberals won were within hundreds of votes. You know, they weren't, you know, slam dunk with everything. I think I go back to Tim at the moment and agree with him fully that this is really an internal issue, and we don't know where it's going to shake out over the next period of time. And I also would believe that if he went to caucus and they decided, you know, he's got all the sway there is to stay in power and to do, you know, the path forward. But I think it's going to be unsettled times while the prime minister is going about meeting with Donald Trump, meeting with the premiers. You know, they've got the G7 that's coming up. We've got, you know, a cabinet to be picked. I mean, it becomes a bit of a sideshow. It's right now there's a lot of air that's being filled with a whole lot of stuff that's really off the campaign trail. But I do believe that within the next week or so, we're going to start to see Mark Carney and the Liberal government under his leadership start to emerge. And the more substantive questions about how do you deal with Daniel Smith? I mean, how do you deal with, you know, the economy, which, you know, they were saying now could lose 68,000 jobs in Ontario alone, and is going to already, you know, the GDP is sliding in both Canada and the United States. The anxiety levels, I looked this morning, even in Britain, it's the lowest level of consumer confidence probably in 25 years. I mean, these are really big issues that are going to have to take stage, and we will be distracted from all of this kind of inside the beltway stuff and move on to the bigger issues. The question for the Conservatives is really, you know, how do they settle that meeting with caucus? That's my view. And I think it's going to be a foregone conclusion that while there may be some opposition from the outside, I think Mr. Poilievre is going to hang tight. I think he'll be there. And his script is already determined. He already knows how he's going to play this out. But I think we're going to be talking a very different game next week when, in fact, we've got movement on the big issues of this country, and we're not talking about this.
Okay, so let's get back to the issues at hand at Queen's Park. And Doug Ford was out in front of the media this week and talking about a variety of things, and not quite sure how he got onto the judges issue, but boy, did he take a tear.
Boom.
And yeah, and we'll play the clip, and I want to come back and just provide some context on this because I think the media missed the point a little bit on this, Tim.
And there's a lot of terrible, terrible bleeding heart judges out there. You know something? If it happened to them, they might take a different look at it. And that's not a knock against all the judges, because there's good, qualified judges. We have great chief justices. Matter of fact, probably the best in the country. But the system's broken. We were democratically elected as a government. And I always say, the legislature is supreme, meaning the people are supreme. When you get a mandate to do something, you can't have judges constantly overruling the government. Or I have an idea. And then again, I'm going to emphasize, not all the judges. I've said it 3 times. But why don't we have the next election, the PC party, the Liberal Party, the NDP party, the Green Party, and the Judges Party? Because they overturn everything, right down to the bike lane. Because of the decisions the judges have made in the past have cost us $10 billion. And we ran on a mandate. We got elected democratically. Last time I checked, there hasn't been any judges elected. Maybe that's the problem. We should do what the U.S. does. Let's start electing our judges, holding them accountable. And that's my rant for the day, because I've just had it.
So is that the sound of the cheese slipping off the cracker there, Tim? What's going on?
No, I love that guy. I'd vote for him 10 times if I could. I love that rant. I like it when we say ranting Doug from time to time, because what happens now, get it out of his system. And I think, just like we saw him rant not too long ago about people who are on welfare, sitting on the couch, not going and getting a job or making an attempt. And the facts were on disability or whatever, but the authenticity cut through. I think a lot of people agreed with the sentiment. And I think a lot of people agree with the sentiment right now that something has gone wrong in our judicial system. Now, do I think Doug is actually sincere that he wants judges to be elected? No, that's just part of the rant. But does he want legitimate reform? I think so, and I can't blame him. Look, there is no constitutional right to a bike lane. This makes me, here's the Hudak version of the rant, I guess, as well, right? Like, for the judge to say he needs to look at the evidence behind Parliament's decision, no. Parliament decides, they're elected to decide. If you break some sort of constitutional rule or the charter, okay, that's judge's territory, but show me bike lanes. And then when you see judges say that the province doesn't have the right to reduce municipal council, and they say that the province doesn't have the right to freeze wages, I think this has gone way beyond what the intention was when the charter was brought home in the 1980s. So I think the Premier is right on principle, and I think a lot of people would agree with him.
Kathleen, the whole rant started about bail, too. I mean, that was the issue, about people being let out early or let out on bail and then, repeat criminals. So it's all over the place. But at the same time, I think it's a rant that a lot of people can find something that they like in that rant. There was a minute and a half there that we showed. It went on a little longer than that. But there's something in there that most people can point to and say, that, oddly enough, is reasonable.
Oh, I guess so.
No, huh?
I have to say, guys, this man gets away with things that other humans in a similar situation would not get away with, because I think for a number of reasons, nobody really expects him to be a thoughtful policy wonk, right? Nobody really expects him to give a reasoned, rational argument about bail or environmental protection or education or anything, quite frankly. Operating from his gut is what people expect him to do. So the presence of evidence, the objective kind of evaluation of issues, it's not what Doug Ford does. And fine, it's gotten him elected 3 times, and that's great. Is it good governance? I don't think so. And I think that, yes, there are people who on the face of it would say, yeah, that's not a bad idea. Maybe we should elect judges, without any idea what it would mean to have members of the judiciary campaigning for their office and having to, raise money and essentially be politicians. And so I get what you're saying, Tim. Particularly, I understand that authenticity, but when authenticity verges on sort of an ignorant denial of evidence. I mean, the reason this judge has got an injunction on the case on bike lanes is that there was no evidence for the government's case, right? So
it's not a constitutional right. That's not in the charter evidence.
I know that the issue about bike lanes isn't, but the issue about making a decision. Anyway, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a judge, but the fact is that the provincial government overrode a decision by a elected municipal government, and there are people who think that's not right, and they've taken that to court, and the judge has said, I need to look at this. Anyway, I think that, to the point about Doug's style and his authenticity, and I've heard people talking about on the radio this morning, oh, that's just Doug, and you're laughing about it, and I get it. Big old Doug, hail fellow, well met, excellent. But the reality is, do good decisions get made? Do good decisions get made about school boards? Do good decisions get made about environmental protection? Do good decisions get made about the judiciary? I don't know. And I would say that in a lot of those cases, no. The answer is no. Good decisions don't get made, because this is not somebody who is paying attention to what actually works, what the evidence actually says, and where we should go in terms of good policy. So I can't join in the kind of fraternal club that thinks that this is funny. I think it really leads to bad governance, and I think he's emboldened right now. He's just won his 3rd majority. I get that. I think he thinks he can do whatever he wants, and anybody who gets in his way is going to get trampled on, because that's who he is.
John, somewhere in all of that, go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, just to respond, I admire the ability in rant to add the humor, like the notion of the judge's party running with the robes and their gavels. is amusing to me. But he doesn't mean that. That's important in the American system. He's actually reinforcing the Canadian system of parliamentary supremacy. And yeah, there's room for judges to act where there's a clear violation of the charter. There's notwithstanding clause, they check and balance. I like that system. I think it's made us a very successful country at the end of the day. But when you see judges reinforce your point, Dave, that have ruled from the bench the way the parliaments should or choose not to do, when it comes to weakening bail conditions, when it comes to weakening sentences, or even the notion that judges saying that the police can't remove homeless from the parks, right? I think the premier is right, and other premiers agree that the judiciary has gone too far and is at odds with the deal we made when the charter was brought into Canada.
But at some point, Tim, there is a role for the judiciary to say this might be good politics, but it's not good policy, and that's where the rub is.
No, it's Parliament. Parliament will look at policy. They'll decide on the evidence. There'll be a vote on it. The way the balance as well as the evidence. The judge's job is not to interpret. Did they have a good policy decision? Was it within the charter of the Constitution or is not? That's black and white to me. If they want to decide, well, we looked at the bureaucrats' papers and we saw the consultations, and we rule this way, then they should run.
So you don't think, Tim, that government saying we're going to remove homeless people from parks with absolutely no plan as to where those people are going to go? You don't think it makes sense that there would be some order of institution in this country that would say, wait a minute, that isn't in the best interest of human beings, because you, Doug Ford, have no plan as to what you're going to do with those people. You are standing on your bully pulpit and you are making some populist pronouncement that people should be removed from parks because you don't like the look of them in Etobicoke or whatever the rationale is, but you have not taken the time to develop a policy for where those people should be and how they should be treated with compassion. I'm sorry. I don't think that is within the realm of what a premier or any elected official should be able to do. There should be some check on that.
Yeah, I just don't think there's a right to sleep in a public park. I don't. And yeah, government should invest in homeless shelters. They should find solutions. But should a judge step in with a formula and say you have to adhere to this formula, rate everyone's needs, whether they've got a pet, whether they're a smoker or drug addiction, and find the right home for them before they can move? That's overreach.
But the government has the responsibility to come up with that plan, and then the judiciary doesn't need to step in, Tim.
Yeah, I don't think there's a right to sleep in a park. Bottom line, it's not a right. In voters and public opinion can weigh if the government's being inappropriate in their decisions. I don't see a judge's role there. And the same thing with bike lanes.
John Wright.
Yeah, and I can understand everything that's just been said. I think in this day and age, though, when we look south of the border and we see what's going on, which is basically the gutting of the judicial system, because, the Attorney General is not going to enforce anything a court says. We have the courts now being ignored on many things, and there's lots of things to come which are going to be very difficult for Americans to deal with, especially when you're merging Homeland Security with all of your personal information and you've got ICE in the middle of the night grabbing people and putting them, potentially shipping them off somewhere. The one thing that distinguishes our country from the United States is due process. It's always been kind of a joke that we're based on peace, order, and good government, but that is the foundation. And the only check and balance to the legislature is, in fact, the judiciary. You can say, well, we'll have a consultation every 4 years or so among the public, but that doesn't solve anything today. Secondly, with full disclosure, I know Paul Chavis, who is the justice, and I know him from a professional sense. When we were starting out at Angus Reid, there were a lot of people who took liberties with the company and called us, Angus had worked on the federal Liberal campaign, but they used that as a weapon to doubt our polls and our integrity. And part of the gold standard which was in place there was we actually sued people. Stephen Harper was sued for things he said about our company on CNN, and he took them back. There were others who said things about the company, and they were sued and until they apologized. In fact, I just have a piece of paper which Paul Chavis sent me, which were all the people that he was the solicitor for, and were put up on the wall, in my office. So I knew him through that professional sense, and I never, ever in a million years found him to be a bleeding heart, and B, somebody who was on the side of a political party. Secondly, we also have to recognize that, he was a solicitor, if I recall correctly, for the Toronto Star. So in terms of integrity, that's what I saw. Number two, if I read what was presented to him by the government actually was siding with some of the cyclists' arguments. Like that's what they had. It wasn't kind of a black and white situation. And so I think he took it under advisement. If you're having the government saying, yes, there could be problems if we remove this, cyclists could be put in danger. And if that's the whole point of what it was, what's he supposed to do? So the government had in its documents things that agreed with the other side. And he simply said, I'm going to take the pause now and I'm going to rule on this. Thirdly, it may be that he comes out and says, this is not a charter issue whatsoever. And so we go to that basic due process. So to wrap up that, then goes to the next part, and that is, I don't think you want to have the premier undermining the process of justice. You just don't. But to Tim's point, you understand the sentiment. People are really upset nowadays where judges have been making decisions to let people out on bail conditions, and then they go ahead and do things that we point fingers at the end of the day and say, judges, let them out. We don't have enough judges. We don't have enough court space. In fact, there are people who have been charged with attempted murder who in fact have their cases dismissed because we don't have enough judges to make these decisions. So I hear what the premier is saying, and particularly the venue that he was at, with police cars in the background and talking about judges with, sentiments that don't align with law and order. But I got to tell you, if he is the head of the government and has to respect judicial due process, then I would think he'd be a little more prudent in what he was going to say. So I just say that I'm on the side of due process. I'm on the side of judges because there is no other check and balance. Exactly. Like in our society, we just don't have it. And to simply start saying, let's if we're going to go in this direction, let's have the American system instead. I think that's just outside the bounds of where the public should be hearing this from the premier of the province.
Tim?
I think on that point, I've talked a lot about this issue, that we have imported the American system. And I think that you're seeing, like the American system, more active judges where their Constitution and Bill of Rights trump, altogether the decisions by the House of Representatives, Congress, legislatures. We have a different system, which is the supremacy of Parliament. Yep, some checks, right? A bit mixed from where it used to be. But, I think it's actually the judges that have brought in American-style activism into Canadian courts, and I think it needs to be corrected.
Yeah, but, the other point, we've seen decisions, whether it be an Aboriginal justice and payment. We've seen judges who have even overturned things that the provincial government has said about whether people can advertise during certain timeframes and things like that. There's a whole bunch of stuff here, which, no doubt makes politicians upset. And I agree with you. That there is a fundamental question about how the judiciary is shaping our country, because we're leaving it up to them, and we're using the notwithstanding clause more and more because we can't get past that. There's a whole argument to be made about the Supreme Court and how it was constructed and the people who were there and how they're not keeping, with certain things within the times. I agree with that. But I also think that the public doesn't need to have a lack of faith in due process, because if you put that on bike lanes, then you put it on every other decision that a court is going to make. You leave people who are vulnerable within the system to simply say, well, the legislature and the premier thinks this, and therefore it's just going to steamroll over me. I think you're in perilous grounds when you start to attack the system. But I do think that the premier is right when if he stuck to the issue of saying, we don't have enough provision to keep people safe nowadays, and we have a revolving door, and we need to do things. But equally, Tim, I think you have to agree, we don't have enough judges. There's court space down at Queen and University that's just empty. We have, cases that are being thrown out of court. And again, I go back to this particular case. The arguments that if you actually read I love reading judgments. I think they're great because you actually get the whole history, you get all that sort of stuff. And Paul Shabas would do a great job. But if you even read the brief that the government brought to the table, they're echoing some of the concerns that the cyclists have. So what do? Do you just kind of go, wow, see you later? I'm going to. No, I think we'll get a very learned decision, and I suspect it'll probably go in favor of the government. I'm just guessing, but in favor of the government, because if it starts here, where does it end, right? Like, so.
Well, the judge, I mean, I think, John, to your point, when I said the government had no evidence, what I meant was the government had no evidence for the position that the premier is putting forward, right? There was only evidence for what the advocates are putting forward. But I think you're right. The court may rule that this is not a case that they should be hearing, and so the government will be fine. But I think that issue of planting the seed of doubt about the institution is really dangerous. Whether the premier is being facetious or not, I think he was worked up at the moment, and he went on a rant, and it can be seen as humorous or whatever. But it's my bigger concern is it kind of is who he is, that if something gets in his way, he wants to move that thing out of the way. And if there's, if he gets a bead on about something, then he wants to blow that up. So I think this government, for example, and Tim, I was talking to Deb about this on her radio show yesterday, I think they're coming after school boards. Mike Harris didn't blow up school boards. I think this government, there are people talking to the premier who would like to blow up school boards. So they're building a case about why school boards shouldn't exist. I think that environmental protections they're already at risk. I think they're going to be more at risk in terms of mining permits and in terms of the Endangered Species Act that's being changed under Bill 5. So, there are things that get in the way of what he thinks is the right thing to do. And I'm not saying building houses is not the right thing to do. I'm not saying having functioning school boards or not. I'm not saying that having a strong education system, obviously I believe in that. But just because an institution gets in the way doesn't mean you just blow it up. You need to be more thoughtful than that. And I don't think this government has demonstrated much about their ability to be thoughtful and look at the policy and look at the evidence and use the evidence to make a decision. I mean, we've talked about supervised consumption sites. There is no evidence that supports what the government is doing, and yet the government is doing what it's doing because they think that it's the right thing to do, and there's some anecdotal stuff that the premier is operating on. So we can't operate on anecdotal evidence. We can't operate on the anger of individuals who talk to a particular elected representative, the premier in this case. We have to be able to rely on some kind of objective evaluation of situations, and that's not what's happening.
The role that Doug Ford is, I think, uniquely placed to take on is questioning, and I think reflecting what he actually hears. Like, he has a very finely tuned barometer. Eventually it won't work, but I think it's working very well right now. And the premier is making a point that things are broken. Our judicial system is broken. Our housing system is badly broken. It takes us a decade plus to get a subdivision done. And our permitting process for big projects, like subways, highways, and new mines, is broken. And fair point, you need to make responsible decisions. You need to carefully consider evidence. But I'm just happy to see somebody who's in a position to shake things up, because it's holding Canadians back.
And I know we're almost out of time here, but I agree, Tim, that we do have a broken system, that it's not working, and that the premier is frustrated. But as I said to you, I saw Tim just recently. We had a chance to go into Council Public Affairs, great offices, great people, and sit down with him. I have a background of my professional life, but I have a whole lot of other things that I've done. Even the Premier Wynne knows. I mean, whether my wife and I have been raising money for prostate cancer or involved with the military or all that sort of stuff. But I was a founding member for the Association for the Defense of the Wrongly Convicted with Reuben Carter. I was, Cal Bricker, and I were the first ones that founded that. And so I was with, the Guy Paul Morans and the Donald Marshalls and a whole lot of other people, which today is called the Innocence Project, and gets $1 million a year to go out and make sure that people who are wrongly convicted get out of jail. So I was involved with the formation of that, and not only saw Canadians who were affected by that and ultimately proven innocent, but also understood, internationally, where we had the Maguire sisters come over from Ireland and talk to us about what had gone on there. So my own personal position is, which is divorced from my professional view of the world, is that this is a very precious system. And then if it may be that if the lower two courts say, ultimately, look, it isn't a charter issue, it means that whatever appeal goes afterwards may be shut down, saying there's no reason for you to go any further. But I believe very much in that due process of law, because I've seen how it doesn't work, and I've seen how it destroys people's lives, and it has an impact. And I know we're talking about bike lanes, but if you make the exception for the bike lane, you might as well make the exception for somebody who's behind bars today, awaiting trial for 8 months, who is innocent and got a family at home and have to try and deal with something. That's where our focus should be. And it should be more so to the Premier to be leading the charge to make sure that we do have more justices, that we do have more balance in the system, because ultimately this is affecting people's lives. And I got to tell you, I was on that board for 10 years and I knew Reuben Carter, I knew all these people. And that's my informed view of the world. And that is, you take this away, people are very vulnerable and they don't have any recourse. So,
but you know what? And John, to that point, this is a government that cut legal aid when they first came in, has been slow on their appointments in terms of their arbitration bodies and so on. So if this had been a government that, Tim, all along had been trying to strengthen the system, then I'd probably have a different perspective on this, but it's not. This is a government that has actually undermined the system and has not actually supported just what John's talking about, the people who need the support of the judiciary. So, I think it's dangerous. It was earlier in it was in the winter that the Premier made some offhand comment about, capital punishment. Throwing those kinds of comments out into the public, I think, undermines people's support for the institutions. And if I'm not mistaken, we just had a federal election where one party had spent months saying that everything in this country was broken, and that party didn't win the election. Now, I understand that Trump was a big factor in this, but I'm not sure people across the province or the country believe that everything is broken. There are things that need remediation, Tim. There are things that can be improved, absolutely. But let's look at the evidence for what actually needs to be done in order to improve those things, not just some kind of gut instinct that everything's broken and we just got to throw it out. That does not help the public discourse.
You want to finish off, Tim, before we clear the smoke from the room? Is that?
Yeah,
a vigorous debate.
And it's great debate. And what typically happens is the Premier will give the high level, and it can be done with some color and some emotion, as we saw yesterday. But I will argue the approach that they tend to take, and they made some mistakes, obviously, over 6 years, is rational and is thoughtful. In fact, I believe today legislation being brought in to get more judges on the benches, accelerate that process to get more, police on the street as well. So, over now into a third mandate, they tend to land on their feet. You've got the rant, you've got the general principle, but then they actually get the toolbox open and start fixing it, and I think in a sensible way.
Well, all right. Leave it on a sensible way. We'll do that. That's our effort this week for On the Ledge. And again, if you are watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to the channel because we just drop into your inbox every time we hit the post button. And if you're listening on Apple or iHeart or Spotify, make sure you follow the show. So thanks to John Wright Kathleen Wynne, Tim Hudak, and yes, we missed our friend Keith Leslie, but he promises to be back next week as we continue with the journey of On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. It's good of you to join us. Make sure, as I said, you follow or subscribe to the show, and we'll be right in your ear when we're available. I'm Dave Trafford for Story Studio Network.
I have a YouTube channel right here, as you can all people see. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more content. Look at this. Bye now.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.